למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט, עד יעשך נוגה צדך וישועתה כלפיד ייבא, וראיו גויים צדקך, וכל מלכים כבודך, וכל רע.
Good evening, and thank you once again for joining Insight. Today's episode concludes our series on the early history of the Abrahamic faith. My guest today is Professor Jodi Magness of UNC Chapel Hill, of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She currently serves as the Keenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism. Dr. Magness, please go ahead and introduce yourself and say a bit about your career.
Yes, thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. As you said, I am a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been here at Chapel Hill since 2002. I am an archaeologist by training. I received my BA in archaeology and history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and my PhD in classical archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania. And I specialize in the archaeology of Palestine, meaning the area of modern Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories in the Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic periods. I've conducted many excavations in Israel, and since 2011, I have been directing excavations at an amazing site called Huqoq, spelled Huqoq, in Israel's Galilee, where we are bringing to light a magnificent synagogue building that I think you and I might be talking about in a little while. And yes, there's a picture of one of our mosaic discoveries.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Magness. So please go ahead and set the scene at the end of the First Temple period that leads into the Second Temple period. Describe the atmosphere, what the atmosphere was like around that time.
Right. So just a little bit of background on that for your listeners. So the First Temple period, which is the period when Solomon's temple, the first temple, stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, came to an end in the year 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and sent the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the surrounding area, the Kingdom of Judah, into exile in Babylonia. And this begins a period in Jewish history that we refer to as the Babylonian exile. A period that lasts for approximately 65 years. The land, the area around Jerusalem was depopulated. It wasn't empty, but it was depopulated. It was impoverished, and Jerusalem was lying in ruins. And when we say that the inhabitants of Jerusalem were exiled to Babylonia, what we're really referring to are the upper class residents of Jerusalem, the elite population was sent into exile. The people who remained behind were pretty much, for the most part, the poorer classes, the peasants, the farmers, and as I said, the land was pretty much depopulated and impoverished.
So, has there been any archaeological evidence of a first temple, of a Temple of Solomon?
There is no archaeological evidence of either of the temples, the first temple or the second temple, in the sense of actual physical remains of the building in situ, in its original location. We do have associated with the second temple a couple of inscriptions that were part of a sort of a fence that surrounded the temple, that surrounded the temple building. but no actual remains of the temple building itself, of either the first temple or the second temple, at least not that we know of. I want to emphasize that this does not prove that there were no temples. Quite to the contrary, we have a lot of evidence for the existence of the ancient temples, mostly relating to the second temple, but also to a lesser degree to the first temple, which come from a variety of literary sources. It is not surprising that we do not have archaeological remains of either of the temples, the first temple or the second temple, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's impossible to conduct archaeological excavations on the Temple Mount to see if there are any remains, because, of course, there are two important Muslim monuments on the Temple Mount now, and so it's
The Dome of the Rock, huh?
yes, that's right. Unless you wanted to provoke the outbreak of another world war, you can't tear those down and start digging up there to look for the temples. But personally, I also think that even if it was possible to conduct excavations on the Temple Mount, on the location where we think the temples were located, which is roughly where the Dome of the Rock is today, I don't think that we would find much of anything. And the reason is because after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Temple Mount stood in ruins for hundreds of years. Any building stones that were there would have been carted away for reuse, and or built into later buildings in the area. And so I do think that even if we were able to excavate in that area under the Dome of the Rock today, at the very most, what we might find are cuttings in the bedrock for some of the ancient walls. But I don't think we'd actually find much in the way of the actual structure that has survived. So again, this is a very good example of where the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Okay, but so the only indications we have of a first temple is what comes from the Old Testament?
Well, right. So what the Old Testament, or what many of us would call the Hebrew Bible, and particularly, I mean, some of the most important passages are from when the exiles returned from Babylonia to rebuild the temple. So they built a new temple, the second temple, and there are references there to the rebuilding of that temple on the spot where the first temple stood. And remembering that some of those exiles would have been alive at the time the first temple still stood on the Temple Mount. So yes, there's pretty good evidence from the pages of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament.
So Cyrus II of the Persian Empire, the Jews' return to Israel was based on an edict that he proclaimed, allowing them to return to their homeland. Do you think this was a humanitarian move? Was this a move of geopolitics? I'm saying that based on some comments that are attributed to Cyrus the Great. Things like, bequeathing wealth, dignity to your people, and they will love you, things like that. So there is, to me, a pragmatic element to this act by Cyrus the Great.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, it is pragmatic. So, I mean, so I always like to explain to my students that in modern history today, the Persian Empire gets a pretty bad rap. And the reason is because of the Greek and Persian wars, right? The Persian invasion of Greece in 490 and 480 BC. And so, and most of our information about that comes from the Greeks. So the Persians tend to get portrayed in a pretty negative light in kind of retrospect. But in fact, the Persian Empire was one of the most enlightened empires of the ancient world. If you look at it in the sense of giving native peoples under their rule, what we would call today religious freedom. Because their predecessors, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, for example, who had conquered the kingdoms of Israel and Judah respectively, had forced the upper class populations of those kingdoms to go into exile. And the policy of the Persians was just the opposite. They repatriated exiled peoples to their homelands, not just the Jews, but other peoples as well. So from the way we would look at it today, we would call it, let's say, humanitarian, but it wasn't motivated by, that's a concept that I don't think at that point. It really was very pragmatic. And the reason, there were several reasons for this. Number one, happy subjects made loyal subjects, or loyal subjects made happy subjects, right? So first of all, you're going to have those people who are under your rule be loyal to you. They'll be happy. The Persian king, like many ancient kings, well, like actually pretty much all ancient peoples, believed in a pantheon of gods, right? And so the perspective is, well, if we repatriate all of these peoples to their native lands and allow them to rebuild their temples and worship their gods, those gods will also be on our side, right? And favor of those gods as well, right? The more gods, the better that you have supporting you. And of course, having well-functioning temples throughout the country, throughout the empire, generated a lot of revenue that was taxable. So altogether, it was really a win-win situation for the Persian king.
So who was Ezra and how did he come to lead the returning Jews?
So Ezra was a scribe and a priest who was one of these exiled people from Judah, from Jerusalem, descended from, right, these exiles. And when the Persian king allows, as you say, issues this edict, allowing these exiled people from Judah to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, they are led by a couple of people. One of them is a guy named Nehemiah, who serves as the governor of the little district or province around Jerusalem, which now becomes known as Yehud. And the other is Ezra, who was a priest and a scribe. And not surprising, a priest is a scribe, right? Kind of goes together in many ways. Who was sent basically to oversee the implementation of divine law in the land. And that divine law would have been, well, this is actually debated by a lot of scholars. So qualified here, but apparently would have been some form, early form of Pentateuch law, right? The laws in the 5 books of Moses. Exactly in what form, we don't know, and that's debated. Together with some sort of royal law, right? Royal Persian law. And so Ezra, as somebody who was educated, who could read, who could write, he was sent to implement these laws and to oversee that as these Judahites, these exiles, returned to their homeland.
Okay, but this idea of one God, this idea of a belief in one God was new. It was introduced by the Jews. I mean, it seems as something that someone would have thought of. It seems like a pretty simple idea to come upon, in my opinion. Why do you think it took so long for someone or for a group of people, for a people to introduce the idea of a belief in one God? And why did it resonate even to this day? Because everyone else were worshiping a multitude of gods.
Right. So I'm glad you asked that, and it's a very complicated question, because I don't actually think that the Jews, and now we're in the Persian period and beyond, were monotheistic. I believe, and again, not all scholars would agree with my point of view, but I think that they were monolatrous, as were at least some of their predecessors, the Israelites, before 586 BC. So let me clarify the difference between those terms. So you have to understand that in the ancient world, everyone, all peoples, and originally this is true also of the early Israelites when they first come in, after the time of Moses and so on, all peoples believed in many different gods and goddesses, right? And the difference was that different peoples might worship different pantheons of gods and goddesses. They might have different gods and goddesses, but they all worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses. And pretty much all peoples, or sometimes individual cities or whatever, would have their own special patron deity, a national god or goddess who they worshiped above all others as their special protector. And the best example I can give you of this is the city of Athens, where the Athenians, of course, worshiped many different gods and goddesses, but Athena was the special patron deity of the city, and the city was named in her honor. And so the early Israelites were like that. They worshiped many different gods and goddesses. We know this from the pages of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. We also know of it from archaeological evidence, for example. But what came to distinguish them is that they worshipped that their special national god, their special patron deity was the God of Israel. And eventually, a belief developed among some Israelites, not all Israelites, that the God of Israel was a jealous God who would not tolerate the worship of other gods alongside him. And those people began to argue that that you should not worship other gods, and they became monolatrous, right? So they became the worship of only one God. Now, that does not mean denying the existence of other gods. And by the way, if you think about the commandment, you shall have no other God beside me. I mean, that doesn't make any sense unless you think that there are other gods. I mean, otherwise, there's no reason for a commandment like that, right? And you
Right.
have plenty of other examples of this in the pages of the Old Testament. So for a very long time, many of the ancient Israelites were polytheistic, but worshiped the God of Israel as their national deity. But some came to be monolatrous and worshiped only the God of Israel, but did not deny the existence of other gods. They just did not worship them. By the time we get into the Second Temple period, which is what we're talking about, it's true that there was still, I think that by this point we can pretty much safely say that, the Jews were monolatrous. They're worshiping only one God, the God of Israel. But again, that doesn't mean that they're denying the existence of other gods and goddesses. And you can even see this in the pages of the New Testament, where sometimes the God of Israel is referred to as the God Most High, right? The highest God. And that is a phrase which makes no sense unless there are other gods. Why would God be the highest God if there aren't any other gods? You either have one God or you have no gods. So, or many gods, right? So it doesn't make any sense. So I think, this is my opinion again, that for a very long time, Jews were monolatrous in the Second Temple period. Jews were monolatrous, but they were not monotheistic. Monotheistic, as opposed to monolatry, monotheism is the belief that only one God exists, whereas monolatry is the worship of only one God, but not denying that other gods exist. And I actually, and again, I just want to say, not all scholars would agree with me, but my personal opinion is that you don't really have monotheism in the modern sense of the word, the way that we refer to it today, right? There's only one God that exists.
Mhm.
So much later, when Christianity really becomes, entrenched, and the worship of pagan gods goes out, and there's no more pagan temples, no more cults to pagan gods, and effectively there is only a worship at that point of one God, right? There are no other gods there to function. So that's my opinion about this, right?
So, at the beginning of the first century, what was the state of Judaism? What were there multiple interpretations of the Torah? Was it a diverse
Oh yeah.
religion? What state was Judaism in at the beginning of the first century CE?
Right. And so, by the time we get to the late Second Temple period, so the time of Jesus, first century BC, first century AD, we're talking about a period when, yes, the laws in the five books of Moses existed, and apparently were considered authoritative by pretty much all Jews. We know this from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have copies of these biblical books that are preserved. And what Jews came to believe is that those five books of Moses contain laws that the God of Israel gave his people, which govern various things from ethical behavior to how the God of Israel wants to be worshipped, to how you should observe certain the Sabbath and dietary laws and so on and so forth. And so once these laws kind of became codified, and or not even codified, but fairly firmly entrenched and authoritative, what you begin to see are disagreements among different groups of Jews about how to properly interpret and practice those laws. So all Jews agreed. I mean, I don't think that there was a disagreement among Jews that those laws should be followed. The disagreements were about how should the laws be followed? How do you properly and correctly interpret and observe those laws? Because the consequence of not doing it correctly is that you have the potential to alienate the God of Israel, who by this point is your sole protector. And so the last thing that you want to do is have him abandon you, right? So you want to make sure that you get it right when you observe the laws that he told you to observe. And that's so by the time we get to the time of Jesus, the late Second Temple period, what we have is the development of many different Jewish groups and what are sometimes called sects, but not in the Christian sense of the word. Sect and sectarianism in this period are not negative things. It's just describing different groups of Jews who interpreted and practiced the law differently from each other. It doesn't have that negative Christian connotation that the word sect develops later. So there are all these different Jewish groups and sects. Jesus's movement is an example of one of them, right? And they're not arguing about the need to observe the law. They're arguing about how to correctly interpret and practice it.
And who was authoritative? I mean, whose view on this was most followed?
Oh, well, yeah, whose view was most followed? Well, I don't know if we can actually say that. I mean, the two most prominent groups are the Pharisees and Sadducees. There's a fairly marginal group called the Essenes who are associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the ones that had the most authority would have been the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were basically the elite, the Jerusalem elite, and they included pretty much the priesthood that operated, that controlled the sacrificial cult in the Jerusalem temple. So obviously they would have had a great deal of authority in the way that they ran the temple. But we also know that the Pharisees, who had a lot of influence among the local population in terms of the way that they interpreted the law. And we can see that manifested both in our literary sources, but also in archaeological evidence, where we find the spread of practices associated with Pharisaic belief also reflected in the archaeological record, like large numbers of stone vessels that appear, or large numbers of Jewish ritual baths that appear at different sites in this period, which reflect the spread of the observance of ritual purity among large sectors of the population, and again, are associated with a more Pharisaic interpretation of the law.
I'm sorry, this question takes us back to before the First Temple period, but the what's called the Merneptah stela, which was discovered, I believe, in 1208, and is attributed to Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of Ramses. It suggests the existence as far back as about the 13th century of people of Israel. Is that how far back the people of Israel go, or even further than that? Is this definitive proof that such a people existed around that time or before that time?
Right. So you're right that stele, which is like an inscription on a stone slab, right? It's a victory.
Yeah, he's bragging about his conquest
Yes,
of
that's
these
right.
different lands, including Israel.
Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more, or something like that,
Right.
right? And so there's that. It's true that is the earliest reference to Israel. It's the problem is there's no contextualization, in the sense that we don't know exactly what Israel is referring to here, right? So, I mean, yes, it's valuable because it's the earliest reference that we have, as extra biblical reference that we have to Israel. But how to interpret it is, we don't. I mean, that's kind of a red herring, and we don't have any other archaeological evidence for that, definite archaeological evidence for Israelite presence before that. I mean, we don't have anything, and it's not really so surprising. I mean, it's very hard even after that, right, to try and say what in the archaeological record is Israelite and what is not, right? Were the people who used certain types of pottery, were they Israelites or not? It's very difficult to do that in archaeology. So again, this is a case where I like to always try and explain to people that archaeology is a scientific discipline. It's not an exact science, but it is a science. And like all sciences, it is equipped to answer certain types of questions, but not other types of questions. And the trick is to ask the right questions. And case of a kind of a question that archaeology is really not very well equipped to answer.
Okay. Well, in the first century, when Jews make a reference to the kingdom of God, what did they mean, and how did the Roman occupation view this reference?
Right. I don't actually think that their conception of the kingdom of God was a lot different from the concept that most people would have today. I mean, the ultimate goal, this is connected, of course, with this apocalyptic ideal, right? This idea that this sort of eschatology where you are looking forward to an end of days, right? This eschatological scenario where the current world order comes to an end, and when this world order ends, and it's going the end of the current world order will be accompanied, in this sort of apocalyptic scenario, by turmoil, by upheavals, by the arrival of at least one Messiah, depending on your beliefs, sometimes maybe even more, and ultimately will culminate with the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, right? The kingdom of God is really what they're looking forward to, is the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. And, uh, you know, um,
I
every,
imagine the Romans didn't look kindly upon this reference. The Roman
well,
occupation, I mean.
I mean,
Well, I mean,
it is actually a subversive, right? It's a subversive kind of point of view, because it means that whatever you have now isn't going to last forever,
right.
and it will be replaced, right? Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the Romans, I don't know how bothered the Romans would have been by that concept. I think the Romans were much more, I don't know, I think they were much more practical, and probably were more occupied with actual trouble on the ground, so to speak, right? So if they, I mean, what you see, at least the way Josephus describes things going on in the first century AD, is the Romans getting very nervous when you have lots of people, Jews or Samaritans or whoever, congregating together, and they begin to sort of, there begins to be a kind of a atmosphere of unrest and stuff like that, and then you see the Romans overreacting. Now, sometimes that unrest was connected with apocalyptic expectations, but sometimes it wasn't. But that's where you see the Romans really, getting involved, right? When you have those kinds of scenarios. So I don't know actually that the Romans had any particular, that they felt so threatened by apocalyptic beliefs. Maybe I don't, I mean, I think that they were more sort of, okay, on the ground, what's happening? Let's keep this all under control, kind of a thing, right?
So King Harold reconstructed the Second Temple, I believe. Is this accurate?
Yes, he completely rebuilt the second temple. He rebuilt the actual temple building, and he also rebuilt and expanded the Temple Mount, which is the enormous open paved platform or esplanade on which the temple building sits.
But he wasn't well liked by his people, I understand. So did they have problem reconciling, that such a person, such a despised king, would reconstruct this holiest of places? Did they have any trouble reconciling, the fact that such a person built such a sacred place, or they did not bother with that?
Right. So let me just say. So first of all, I want to make clear: Herod was not a nice man. he he was ruthless as a ruler. He eliminated, that is, had killed many members of his own household, including one of his wives, his most beloved wife, and two of her sons. And he also had another son put to death just 4 days before he died. And so he was not a nice man. He was, he was a very sort of Machiavellian politician in a way. Um, but our perspective on Herod is a little bit skewed, because we don't have any writings that Herod left that he wrote. All of our written information about Herod comes from sources that are hostile to him, particularly Josephus, who drew his information. Josephus did not overlap with Herod. Josephus was born about 40 years after Herod died. But Josephus drew his information from the court biographer of Herod, whose name was Nicolaus of Damascus. And then Josephus basically repackages it and presents Herod in a very negative light, and that's where most of our information about Herod comes from. And then, of course, there's the famous story of the massacre of the innocents in the Gospel of Matthew, where again Herod is presented in a very negative light. So one of the problems with the way that we view Herod is that, all of our sources on him are extremely hostile and probably really went out of their way to make him sound even worse than he was. So there is that, and I actually think that there's pretty good evidence that a significant portion of at least the Jerusalem elite actually liked Herod a lot, because they imitated things that he did, and it's kind of a long story actually. I don't want to go into it, but I want to just say that right out now. But in later history, in the perspective of later history, you're right. Herod has a very bad reputation, and a lot of it deservedly so. So with the Jerusalem temple, actually, I think that no, it didn't actually bother the Jews because it was the temple. It was their, and, I think that whether or not they liked Herod, they loved the temple, right? So I don't actually think it bothered them. I do think an interesting question is, why did Herod rebuild the temple? And I think that might have been one of your upcoming questions, right? Why did he go to all this trouble to rebuild the Jerusalem temple and on such a
Yeah,
magnificent,
whether he was compensating for the fact that he wasn't of dynastic blood,
right?
he didn't descend from the Hasmoneans. Uh,
Exactly. So right. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons, and I not mutually exclusive. So one of them was to win the popularity of those Jews who didn't like him, for sure. One is to kind of legitimize himself in the eyes of the population that didn't accept him as a legitimate king because he was not descended from the native Jewish dynasty, the Hasmoneans. Um, and I wrote a long article about this. It was published, I think, in 2019. I actually think that Herod was also, and this is not something there have been other people who said this, but it's been kind of a very marginal point of view. I actually think that Herod was trying to situate himself as a kind of a Solomon in the line of Solomon, right, building the temple, but also in the line of David by way of Solomon, right? And therefore situating himself in the line of a Davidic Messiah, right? So he's trying to connect himself to a messianic figure. And just to remind your listeners, for Jews, the Messiah is not a god. A Messiah is
a messenger?
a human figure, and a Davidic Messiah, particularly, would be a royal figure descended from David, right? And so the many Jews believed and still do believe that the Messiah, and by the way, Christians believe this too, because the Gospels of Matthew and Luke connect Jesus to David, right? That the legitimate Messiah will be descended from David. And I think that one of the things that Herod was trying to do was to portray himself, right, as a legitimate Messiah by connecting himself to David. And he was doing this in various ways that, again, it would take us a long time to go through the reasons but I think
But
that's,
was he a tool of the Romans?
was he a tool of the Romans?
I
In,
mean, well, did he carry out the will of the imperialist, basically?
um,
Did he want to be seen in a good light by the Romans, and so did
well,
things that they required for the most part?
I don't think the rebuilding of the temple has anything to do with what the
Now
Romans
I'm
wanted.
talking about projects like Caesarea.
Right.
Uh, uh,
Well,
uh,
the Romans didn't ask him to build Caesarea. I mean, but I do think you're right. I think that,
but he named it after Caesar, the Roman emperor.
right. So Herod, of course, was appointed king of Judea by the Romans, specifically through the influence of Mark Antony, who was his patron at the time. And so of course, I mean, and then later, after the Battle of Actium, he pledges allegiance to Octavian, that is Augustus. And so, of course, he was dependent on their favor to rule as king of Judea, right? They were the ones who appointed him king of Judea. So for sure, Herod was very careful about making sure that he didn't do anything to offend the Romans. I don't
But he
know.
had his own agenda, of course.
Yeah, I mean, carrying out their policy, I'm not sure exactly what that means. Carrying out their policy in this case, I think, means governing effectively the territory that he was ruling on their behalf. And one of the things that you have to think about is the geography and the fact that this kingdom would have been a buffer between the rest of the Roman Empire farther to the west and the other peoples to the east who were outside the Roman Empire, such as the Parthians, right? And so it would have been in the Romans' interest to keep this, kingdom as a barrier, right, against, or a buffer, right, against threats further to the east. So I don't think that Herod built Caesarea because the Romans asked him to. To the contrary, right? And I don't think that's what you're suggesting, right? What he did was to, after the Battle of Actium, to make sure that he displayed to Augustus his loyalty in as many ways as possible. And that meant things like building this new city on the coast, and naming it in honor of Augustus, Caesarea, building another one in the area of Samaria, right, and renaming it Sebastos, which is also the word Augustus in Greek. And so, for sure, absolutely. He also, by the way, gave benefactions to communities outside of the area of Palestine. So, yeah, so
And did
Herod,
he model some parts of Caesarea as a Roman city?
well,
Complete with
well,
Roman baths
no,
and
right. But again, this wasn't to win the loyalty of the Romans. This was because I don't think that there was anything about that would have won the loyalty of, let's say, Augustus, right? Except, well, Augustus now had a beautiful Greco-Roman city, on the coast too, named in his honor. But if you look at Herod's buildings all throughout his kingdom, they're all distinguished by an incorporation of and really innovate, really a lot of innovation. So the incorporation of different elements that always produces something unique and different. The incorporation of Greek or Hellenistic elements with sometimes Roman elements and native elements, whether they're Judean or Nabatean, because Herod was half Nabatean. So Herod's Herod, going back to before, Herod has this terrible image in later history, right?
mhm.
Most people, except for archaeologists. In archaeological circles, Herod is known as the greatest builder of the country. He, more than any one person, left his mark on the landscape, an everlasting mark on the landscape, and the way in which he managed to mix all of these different elements to produce something that was really startling and new is amazing. It's extraordinary, and we really don't see that anywhere else. So, but I don't think he was doing. I think it's self-aggrandizement in this case, right? I don't think he's doing this for the Romans. He's doing it for himself, right? Yeah.
Okay. So, how accurate the methods you use, the methods that archaeologists use to date items that they find, how accurate can this dating method get? How granular can this dating be? Or is it mostly
Right.
guesswork within a certain?
Well, okay. So, right. I just want to go back to one thing about Herod a minute, because I do want to say one. So, places like Caesarea and Samaria, but also in other places outside of Judea, Herod built temples dedicated to Augustus and Rome, right? So again, displaying his loyalty, but I also think, but then he builds the temple in Jerusalem, right? Rebuilds. I actually think that Herod, because there's a lot of questions about whether Herod was Jewish or half Jewish, he was, let's say, half Jewish on his father's side of the family through forced conversion, because his grandfather was an Idumean who was converted to Judaism forcibly by one of the Hasmonean kings. And Herod's mother was not Jewish; she was Nabatean. So, I actually think that Herod had a kind of a Roman worldview in terms of the way that he thought of gods. The Romans had a very inclusive worldview. They believed that there's a multitude of gods and goddesses out there, some of whom we know and we worship and have names, and others that we're unfamiliar with, that we don't know exist. and that all gods deserve piety. This is a very important principle among the Romans, is piety. And so when the Romans would conquer a people who worshipped other gods and goddesses, they would usually incorporate them into their pantheon, either by identifying them with gods and goddesses they already worshipped, right? So Athena becomes Minerva, right? Zeus becomes Jupiter. Or if the god or goddess,
These are Greek gods that are now have Roman designations.
that's right, exactly, that the Romans identify, right? Or they would, if the god or goddess was so weird and unparalleled in their own pantheon, they would then incorporate them as they were. So, like the Egyptian goddess Isis, for example, right? And the Romans themselves had debates about some of these exotic cults, right? Now, the God of Israel was a kind of a problem, because the God of Israel was a God who could only be worshipped exclusively, right? The Jews believed that the God of Israel would not tolerate the worship of other gods alongside him. And so if you're a Roman and you want to incorporate the worship of the God of Israel into your pantheon, what do? You're a little bit stuck, right? Because if you do want to worship the God of Israel, but the God of
You
Israel
have to worship him alone.
those others, right? You're kind of stuck there, right? Anyway, so getting back to Herod, I actually think that Herod had a kind of a Roman worldview on this, in the sense of inclusivity. I think that and I actually think that partly at least, Herod's rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple wasn't completely selfish. I think part of it actually was out of piety, to honor the God of Israel. And I think that, you see the establishment of other temples to other people or gods or whatever by Herod. And I think this kind of reflects this sort of inclusive worldview that, that we don't generally see among Jews in this period, right? And I think that kind of goes back to Herod's background. Anyway, okay, so sorry, I got off on a little bit. But you asked about the
dating methods. How accurate are they
so
in archaeology?
you have to understand. Okay, so in a minute I'll tell you about what the major dating methods are, but you have to understand that archaeology is all about context. And so the kind of dating methods that you use and the way that you use them depends on the context. So even dating methods that seem to be exact aren't necessarily exact, depending again on how they're used and the context. So we have in archaeology, I always like to explain this in this way to my students. Whatever method of dating you use, either it has to be something that carries its own date, or it has to be an extremely common find on archaeological excavations. And so extremely common finds on archaeological excavations would be mostly in the periods and the places I work, pottery. Pottery does not carry its own date, but it can be dated through a very complex process, roughly, not exactly. It has ranges. Different types of pottery can be dated roughly by working out a typology, a sequence of types. It's very complicated. I did it for one period of time for Jerusalem. Took me a long time to do it. But it can be done, and pottery is a very important tool for dating in archaeology, but again, not precise. So depending on the particular type of pottery, it can have ranges between 50 years, 100 years, more than that. So that's one. The kinds of things that carry their own date would include, for example, coins. But coins, because of course coins have a date on them, right? They were minted, so that's great, right? You would think that's exact. And it is exact, but it's not exact. And there are many reasons. First of all, coins were only invented in around 600 BC. So before that, you don't have coins. Even after you have coins invented, nearly all the coins that circulated in antiquity were made of copper or bronze. They're tiny little things about the size of your pinky nail. And most of the time, they've corroded into little lumps of green metal. And it's impossible to read the date on them anymore, even if they're sent to a lab and cleaned up. So a lot of times we find coins and you can't read the date on them anymore. Another thing that you have to bear in mind with coins is that coins circulated for long periods after they were minted in antiquity. I mean, if you open up your wallet now, you'll find coins that were minted, let's say 20 years ago. But in antiquity, it was even more than that. They would circulate for even longer. They could circulate for 100, 200 years, even more, before they were lost. So if you find a coin on the floor of a house, you could be misled because that coin could have circulated for a long time before it fell onto the floor of the house.
Right.
So even with the coins, there are problems, right? Then we have scientific methods of dating, like radiocarbon dating is the best known. And without going into the whole thing about radiocarbon dating, I'll just say it is, it's great because it's a laboratory-based method of dating, but it's also it's not problematic. It's not exact because first of all, it depends on what you're dating. Are you dating wood or are you dating seeds? And first of all, it relies on finding organic material, because only organic material can be radiocarbon dated. And organic materials are precisely the kinds of materials that usually aren't preserved in archaeological excavations after thousands of years. And then it depends on what you're finding. So if you find a lump of charcoal, which is, burnt wood, or you find seeds, well, it depends. So the problem with wood is that you can get an old wood kind of a thing, especially in the Middle East, where a tree was chopped down, but there was a roof beam for a long time. And then after the roof collapsed, that roof beam was rebuilt into something else. And it wasn't actually chucked into a campfire until centuries after that tree was chopped down. Seeds are better because seeds, will be deposited usually after a harvest season. After a year or two, you won't get seeds surviving for a long time like wood. But it's also, they're much rarer to find, in archaeological excavations to be used for dating. And then if you actually do get that material for dating purposes, the radiocarbon dates always give you a range. So they'll give you like a range of, like, let's say that tree was chopped down 2,000 years ago, plus minus 100 years either way. And that's a 67% chance of it being within that range. So again, it's giving you a range. It's not giving you a precise date, right? So it'll kind of hopefully it'll go along with your other dates, but it's not giving you the day of. The only things that really are going to give you a very precise date are historical sources when you have them and they're reliable. And so to give you or inscriptions, dated inscriptions. So for example, Josephus tells us that, it was Herod the Great who built Masada, and that Masada fell, in either 3 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, right? So, so there you have, or you have a date associated with the Nea Church in Jerusalem that tells us that it was Justinian who built this church, and it gives a year, but there the calendrical date is actually disputed because it's a Byzantine indiction, and indictions are cycles of 15 years, and within the reign of Justinian, there were 3 indictions, and so it's not clear exactly which of those years it was. So anyway, it's very rare to get an absolute, date that's an exact date, as opposed to, let's say, a range, right? And that's why archaeologists argue so much among ourselves.
Okay, so let's. Okay, I'm hoping that we can go a little over since we started late.
Yep.
Probably about 15 minutes over, but I want to go to a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion. Okay.
Great. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome to Matilda Healthcare Services. At Matilda Healthcare Services, the personal care of your loved ones is our mission, which we transform into a set of goals, and finally into our service offerings centered around individual clients. Our client-centered approach to personal home care ensures that your loved ones are provided individual attention, allowing them to maintain the quality of life they deserve. These services fall into 3 main categories: medical services, companion services, and physical therapy. Medical services include medication management, monitoring vital signs, diabetic care, colostomy care, Foley catheter care, respiratory treatment, feeding tube care, wound care, intravenous and nutrition therapy, injections, monitoring serious illness, and monitoring unstable health status. For companion services, we offer transportation to appointments and excursions, housekeeping, assistance with bathing, dressing and grooming, ambulation, meal preparation, environmental safety, medication reminders, laundry, and more. Physical therapy includes the following: evaluating patients' records and progress, assistance with speedy recovery from injury or illness, assistance with improving movement, pain management, preventive care, rehabilitation, and treatment of chronic conditions. For a free, no-hassle assessment, call 214-886-7170 or email idayama@mateldahealthcareservices.com.
Brought to you by Matilda Healthcare Services. Matilda Healthcare Services, providing quality care, one patient, one home at a time.
Welcome to Roberts E-Commerce Solutions. To promote your business or upcoming event on social media platforms, Roberts E-Commerce Solutions can help. Ensure your peace of mind by calling Roberts E-Commerce Solutions. From the intricacies of unleashing social media campaigns to scaling up visibility for your business by leveraging the use of Facebook-owned parallel platforms, Instagram, and WhatsApp, Roberts E-Commerce Solutions promises expertise. We can create and deploy promotional videos, flyers, and other digital assets concurrently, creating a multi-pronged approach that delivers visibility. For video promotions, we can use compelling motion graphics templates such as titles, intros, outros, transitions, logo reveals, and other elements to bring the essence of your ideas to life. Besides creating digital assets, we also understand how to navigate across the various business components contained within Facebook's Meta Business Suite, an appliance that centralizes and links Facebook to Instagram and WhatsApp, as well as the resulting analytics that can all be viewed on a single dashboard. Meta Business Suite allows small businesses the ability to effectively launch targeted ads based not only on geography, but also on demographics and the interests of potential customers. To schedule a free consultation, call 682-7-850-847 or email info@consult-res.net. Roberts E-Commerce Solutions, empowering small businesses and nonprofits.
Welcome back to Insight. Today I am talking to Dr. Jodi Magness of University of North Carolina, located in Chapel Hill. Dr. Magness, Dr. Magness, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Why were Jews discouraged from intermarrying during the Second Temple period? My understanding is that religious leaders discouraged Jews from marrying peoples of other nations or people who weren't Jewish. Why was this?
Yeah, that's actually $1 million. We know when it starts, but exactly why is, it starts with Ezra. Well, it's attributed to Ezra and Nehemiah, when the exiles come back to Jerusalem in the Persian period, and Ezra implements this ban on intermarriage and tells men who married foreign wives that they have to divorce them because they have polluted the people and the land. This was not actually something that was particularly a concern before 586 BC. So why? My own personal opinion is it reflects aristocratic snobbery. And this sort of concern with purity of bloodlines and genealogy, because the people who the Jerusalemites who were exiled to Babylonia in 586 BC were the upper classes. And we know that while they're in exile in Babylonia, they preserve, lists of genealogies and who's descended from who and so on. And then they come back under the leadership of Ezra, And what do they find? They find the poor people there who had stayed behind and in the meantime had intermarried with others. And of course, again, they hadn't, right? Because they're all part of this kind of elite class. So I think I think it kind of reflects a perspective that is very aristocratic, snobbish, elitist, upper class, a concern for purity of bloodlines. But it also, of course, is connected with, it becomes connected with or is connected with already at that point a belief that this is what the God of Israel wanted of his people. That is that you should not, intermarry with peoples of other nations, right? And this should be the land of the God of Israel and his people. So anyway, yeah. But
So, during the first Jewish revolt, some of the rebels escaped to the Rock of Masada, which was said to be built by King Herod. I'm not sure how true that is, but anyway, the Roman formed a siege around Masada, and according to Josephus, the Jewish historians, the defenders of Masada committed suicide rather than submit to the Romans. Now, you co-directed the excavation of the Roman siege works at Masada. Were your findings in line with the story that Josephus told, or did you find something different?
right. So thank you, by the way. That's exactly right. And Herod the Great did originally build the fortress on top of Masada. One of the Hasmoneans reportedly was the first to fortify the top of the mountain, but apparently when Herod built his buildings on top, he obliterated everything that was already there. So what we found actually is very consistent with Josephus's description. But here, thank you for showing the photo, by the way. But here you have to distinguish between Josephus's description of the siege and there's our siege camp. That's right. That's Camp F. You have to distinguish between Josephus's description of the siege and his description of the actual fall of the mountain. The siege, of course, is the process by which the Romans take the mountain, which means they encircle the mountain with a wall, what's called a circumvallation wall, to make sure nobody can escape and nobody can get in to help. They build a series of camps surrounding the base of the mountain to house their troops, and then they build an assault ramp going up the western side of the mountain so that they can get their siege machinery, basically a battering ram, into place to batter through the fortification wall at the top. And Josephus describes all of that, and it is remarkably consistent with what we see in the archaeological record. Where the debates the debates concern the fall of the mountain, right? So what happens at the end of the siege? How did the mountain fall to the Romans? And here is where Josephus describes, as you said, this kind of mass suicide of all of the Jews on top of the mountain. And do we have archaeological evidence that such an event occurred? And the answer is no, that we do not. But the reason is because this is, again, one of those questions that archaeology is not equipped to answer. And so,
What would you have expected to find? Something that would corroborate Josephus' version. What would you have expected to see?
well, what I think people expect to find is our physical remains of lots of skeletons, right, of the people who committed suicide. Because according to Josephus, there were 967 Jews, men, women, and children, on top of the mountain at the time of the siege. So you would expect to find, I mean, what people who want, to see archaeological evidence, I think, expect to see actual remains of, skeletons, right? Skeletal remains associated with the fall of the mountain. We don't have that. We do have a very, very small number of skeletons, and not all of them can be definitely associated with Jewish rebels, because there were other periods of occupation at Masada. And so, when Yigael Yadin, who was the famous Israeli archaeologist who excavated the top of Masada in the 1960s, when he excavated and did not find remains of, lots and lots of skeletons, but he thought Josephus's account was accurate. What he suggested was that when the Romans came up to the top of the mountain and then they left a garrison up there for a couple of decades, that the Romans then cleaned up all of the, the rotting corpses and either burned them or buried them in a pit somewhere. And so, we don't have their remains. But let's assume the opposite. Let's assume that there is no mass suicide. Let's assume that the Romans come up and some of the Jews are killed and others are led away into slavery. Maybe some of them even did commit suicide. Who knows? But anyway, there's no mass suicide, let's assume. Well, the same thing would have happened. The Romans would have cleared out any of the corpses that were lying around and disposed of them. So I don't really know that there is anything that you can. So this is, again, why I say this is one of these questions that archaeology is not equipped to answer. And it's really what I like to, explain to people is it really comes down to a matter of how you interpret and evaluate Josephus as an historian, right? Is he reliable? Is he not reliable? Did he invent stuff? Did he not invent stuff? Did he embellish? It comes down to that, right? So I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a Josephus specialist. So I can tell you what the limitations of the archaeology are, but Josephus specialists disagree on how reliable Josephus's testimony is.
So talk a bit about your current excavation, the one you're carrying out in the village of Hukok, Israel. I believe it is an ancient Jewish synagogue. Talk about some of your findings there.
Right. So since 2011, I've been I've been directing excavations at Hukok, which is spelled, again, it looks weird, Huqoq.
It's Hukok, right? Hukok?
That's right, exactly. We have a dig website, which is hukok.org. In case anybody's interested, you can look at our website and see pictures of our discoveries and media coverage and reports. That's one of our mosaics. And so we've been bringing to light, so Hukok is an ancient Jewish village located just off the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's only a couple of miles away from Capernaum, which of course was the base of Jesus's Galilean ministry, and only a couple of miles away from ancient Magdala, the hometown of Mary Magdalene. And it was a Jewish village actually in the time of Jesus, but my interest is in the centuries after the time of Jesus, when Christianity became the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire, and Jewish villages like Hukok came under Christian rule. And what happens then to these Jewish villages, right? So that's sort of the reason why I started excavating at Hukok, because I wanted to sort of see what was the fate of a Jewish village like this against the background of the rise and spread of Christianity. And one of the things that we've discovered in our excavations is a monumental synagogue building. It was built somewhere around the year 400 AD, and they're talking about dating evidence. We have radiocarbon dates, we have pottery, we have coins. They're all pretty much giving us the same date. So we have this monumental synagogue building that was built around 400 AD that is paved with extraordinary mosaic floors that are divided into panels that depict an array of biblical stories, scenes of Samson, scenes from the book of Daniel, the Noah and the ark, Jonah, the building of the Tower of Babel.
So this is dated back to the time of Jesus,
No,
the synagogue?
around 400 AD, so around
Okay.
400 after the time of Jesus. And so it's just an extraordinary array of mosaics, really something that's unparalleled. And we're going to be continuing our excavations this coming June.
You began this in 2011. Typically, how long?
Yeah.
Because you've been working on that for a decade.
Tell me about it. The original we didn't know that we were going to find something like this. I mean, we were hoping to find a synagogue. We had no idea there would be mosaics like this. And that's, but my original vision was to dig for 5 years, to dig half a synagogue, and after 5 years. But once we found the mosaics, we were pretty much committed to it for the whole thing. So this summer will be my last season digging, because we'll be finishing the synagogue. We'll have exposed all the mosaics by the end of this dig season this summer, and we will then turn to final publication, working on the preparing the final publication.
So the Qumran scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, is attributed to the Essenes. How confident is this link between the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yes, right. Let me make clear. So there are two big kinds. So the site of Qumran, an archaeological site, is located near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are the remains of approximately 1,000 different scrolls that were found in 11 caves around Qumran. Many of those scrolls are copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls is a subset of the Qumran Scrolls?
No, the Qumran Scrolls are the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's okay.
Okay.
So actually, it's funny that you asked that. So Qumran Scrolls are often popularly referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's very good that actually you refer to them as the Qumran Scrolls, because by that what you're doing is you're indicating that these are in fact the scrolls associated with the site of Qumran, as opposed to ancient scrolls that were found at other sites around the Dead Sea that are not connected to Qumran. But because the Qumran scrolls have popularly been called the Dead Sea Scrolls ever since the first discoveries, the name is kind of stuck. And so I still use the term Dead Sea Scrolls to refer to the Qumran scrolls, even though you could use that term to refer to other scrolls from other sites of other dates that are unconnected. The reason I continue to use the term Dead Sea Scrolls and not Qumran scrolls, as you are doing correctly, by the way, is that when you say Qumran scrolls, a lot of the general public have no idea what you're talking about. Right? So everybody's heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. How many people know what you're talking about when you say the Qumran Scrolls? Not everybody is as educated as you are about that, right? So anyway, no, seriously. But a lot of scholars do prefer to use the term Qumran Scrolls for exactly that reason. But so there are two big sort of debates, very broadly speaking, concerning Qumran on the one hand and the scrolls, the Qumran scrolls or Dead Sea Scrolls on the other, right? And one of those debates is the connection between the scrolls and the site of Qumran, because most scholars, myself included, believe that the scrolls were deposited in the nearby caves by the people who lived at Qumran, that there's a connection between the scrolls and the site. Some have argued that there is no connection. It's very easy, actually, to disprove that argument. But anyway, that's one of the arguments. If you believe, as I believe, and a majority of scholars believe, that the scrolls were deposited in the caves by the people who lived at Qumran, then you have to identify the members of that community that lived at Qumran as members of a Jewish sect, a sectarian group. Why? Because the nature of many of the scrolls is sectarian. Many of the scrolls are sectarian literature. So it's clear that they were associated with a group of Jews who belonged to a specific sect. The question is which sect. So many scholars, including myself, identify that sect with the Essenes, who are mentioned in some contemporary ancient sources like Josephus. The problem is, nowhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the word Essene ever mentioned, at least not by that name. And therefore, there are scholars who argue that the Qumran sect should not be identified as the Essenes, that there are differences between what we read in the Qumran scrolls and what we read about the Essenes in our outside sources like Josephus. They argue they're not Essenes, they're some other Jewish sect. I think it's possible actually to refute those arguments, but that is actually, a fairly legitimate debate among scholars.
So the execution of Jesus, well, you can't really talk about the Second Temple period without mentioning Jesus, can you? His execution, was it on the Romans' part? Do you think they were trying to appease the temple authorities, or did they really believe that Jesus was a threat to the Pax Romana?
Well, I don't know if that's a little bit broad to say that he was a threat to the Pax Romana, but I do think what we do see over and over again in, if you look at Josephus, is a concern for outbreaks of unrest in the country led by key figures. And in fact, it's against this background that apparently Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, the son of Herod the Great, had John the Baptist beheaded. That's what Josephus actually says, that Herod Agrippa was afraid that John the Baptist was fomenting unrest. And so I'm not sure saying that he's a threat to the Pax Romana. That sounds a little broad, right? But I do think that the Romans were concerned with trying to keep, the situation as stable as possible. And when they saw somebody who they perceived as fomenting unrest, attracting crowds, they're never.
So you do think that they saw Jesus as subversive?
Well, again, I'm not sure subversive, but as a potential, as somebody who is fomenting unrest, who's attracting crowds of followers, and therefore potentially fomenting unrest. Yeah,
At,
fair
at the
statement. Now,
time that, the
by the
time
way,
that, sorry,
the
go ahead.
the Jerusalem priesthood could have thought the very same thing. I mean, the Jerusalem priesthood, they were the elite. They liked the status quo. Right? They maintained good relations with the Romans, so there's no reason. And so, they didn't want the status quo upset either. So, I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive questions. I'm not saying that the Jerusalem priesthood had Jesus put to death. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that in this case, the interests of the Jerusalem priesthood and the Romans could well have aligned.
So at the time that the Romans crucified Jesus, how often were they crucifying eschatological prophets? How I mean, this is like from the beginning of the first century, say the first quarter of the first century, around the time that they finally executed Jesus. How often were these eschatological prophets being executed by the Romans?
Well, we don't, I mean, in order to be able to answer that, we'd have to have a very thorough, historical documentation or something like that, which we don't have, right?
Was this fairly common?
We
Was
have
this
to,
a fairly common occurrence?
I mean, we know, for example, of an Egyptian Jew who, attracted a following and was his followers were slaughtered by the Romans, but he managed to escape, right? So, I mean, certainly this is something that the Romans were concerned with, but how many? I don't know that there's any way that we can possibly determine that. But yeah, I mean, again, the Romans were concerned with keeping the peace, and they would do that, in any way that they thought was necessary.
So I heard a scholar argue that he did not believe that there were crowds at the crucifixion of Jesus because by this time this was a common occurrence, the Romans executing Jews. And besides, it was the time of the Passover, and people would have been concerned with, involving themselves with the celebrations. So he doubts that there were a crowd at the site where Jesus was executed. What do you think? Where do you stand?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know how we could know that. So did the gospel authors elaborate or embellish by saying that there were crowds? I don't know. I mean, I just don't think we can determine that. I mean, I wouldn't discount the attraction that violence holds for people, in the sense of, I mean, the Romans had, gladiator fights all the time, and they were attended by large numbers of people pretty much every day, right? I mean, and you think about it now, and think about, the repeated broadcasting of episodes of violence on television today, and people watch it all the time. And that's the kind of thing, your eyes, right, the train wreck kind of a thing, you can't take your eyes off of it, right? So, I mean, you know I'm not sure that that's actually a valid argument, that because just because it happened all the time doesn't mean that people didn't watch it or want to
Oh,
watch
and he also said that people would have been afraid to hang around such a site, such a site where executions were being carried out. That was part of his argument.
to be afraid unless you're actually somebody who the Romans.
Is there any archaeological evidence for the execution of Jesus? Any proof that he was in fact executed?
Oh no, because we have no contemporary. We have, the problem is that we don't have any contemporary sources from the time of Jesus, right? All of our sources are later than the time of Jesus, right? So we have the gospel accounts, which date to, let's say, 40 years or more after Jesus's death. And then we have Josephus, if there's a passage in Josephus which may or may not be original and refers to Jesus. So, and then, Paul, I guess, right, if some of Paul's letters or whatever, they're not referring to his execution per se. But anyway, but I mean, there's nothing actually we don't have any literary sources from the time of Jesus that are contemporary with his lifetime. And then we get back into the archaeological thing, which is, what kind of archaeological evidence would you expect? I mean, the only thing that you could possibly do, and this is like the search for Noah's Ark, would be to find an authentic ancient inscription from that period that says, Jesus, this is the grave of Jesus. Jesus is buried here in this year, right? I mean, from, and not like that somebody added later. Well, we don't have anything like that. Of course we don't. We do have ossuaries, little bone boxes from this period, and sometimes they have the name Jesus on them, but it's a very common name in this period. So that doesn't mean anything. So no, I mean, what we have, the best that we can do is to sort of look at the gospel accounts, which again are kind of the closest really you can get in terms of describing his execution and burial. And in my opinion, the gospel accounts are consistent with what we know about how Jews, wealthy Jews, because he's buried in the tomb of a wealthy Jews buried their dead in that period in Jerusalem. But as far as archaeological evidence goes, no, we can't really say anything. I do think that so of course, the site that's been venerated for a very long time as the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? Now that tradition that Jesus was crucified and buried on that spot goes back at least to the time of Constantine, the early 4th century AD. And that's as far as you can go archaeologically in with churches at least in the Roman world, because before the time of Constantine, Christianity was an illegal religion. It was an outlawed religion, and Christians couldn't worship openly. They had to worship in secret. So we don't have any churches that date to before the time of Constantine, right? So we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built by Constantine, early 4th century, over the spot that is venerated as the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. But that still leaves a gap of some 300 years between the death of Jesus and the time that church is built. So then you have to assume that the local population of Jesus's followers preserved the memory that this is where Jesus was actually crucified and buried for that intervening 300 years. Right now, many scholars, including myself, think that that's quite likely. It's unprovable archaeologically, but that it's quite likely that is the case. At any rate, it's as far back as you can go in Christian tradition. I mean, that's as far back as you get stuck with Constantine. You really don't have anything provable before that. But we do have one little piece of evidence that supports that, and that is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just outside the walls of the rotunda, which is where the tomb is located, are ancient Jewish rock-cut tombs that do date to the time of Jesus. They're a particular kind of tomb characteristic of Jerusalem that date to the time of Jesus. It indicates that the area where Jesus's tomb is venerated was part of a Jewish cemetery at the time of Jesus. This is important also because, according to the gospel accounts, Jesus was crucified and buried outside the walls of the city. The Jews in that period buried their dead outside the walls of the city. Typically, people were also crucified outside the walls of the city. So all of this sort of supports the identification of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the authentic spot, because we can say that, in fact, this was a Jewish cemetery in the time of Jesus. Now, whether Jesus was laid to rest in one of those tombs is a leap of faith that archaeology cannot prove, right? So we get to that gap there, right? And that's as close as you get with the archaeology.
So what has been your most surprising find of your career?
The mosaics at Hukok, that's without a doubt.
That would be the most surprising.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, no question about that.
Okay. Second to the last question, can you talk a bit about your experience on the movie Jerusalem? I read that you were featured in that movie.
Yeah, I don't know if you should watch it. It's a fabulous movie. It's a giant screen film. It was National Geographic.
Made for IMAX, right?
Yeah, on IMAX, right. And so it was. It came out. When did it come out? Actually,
2015, I believe.
Right. So thank you. So I worked on that film for 5 years before it was produced with the director and the producers. I was a consultant on that and did a lot of work on it with a lot of scripts and stuff like that. And then I was invited to appear in the film. There are only 4 people in the film who have speaking roles. There are 3 young women and me as the archaeologist. And then the film was narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch, who I never got to meet.
Well, I believe the 3 girls there was one Arab, there was one Jew, and one Christian, and they had them. Okay.
Jew and a Christian. That's right. Exactly.
Talk about what Jerusalem meant to them.
That's
mean
right.
to them.
Exactly. Yeah. How do you tell the story of Jerusalem in a 40-minute film? Right. It's very complex.
Right.
But it was a great experience. You can watch the film. Unfortunately, you won't probably see it on an IMAX screen, but it is just a wonderful, wonderful film. And I've seen it many times. I know it practically by heart, but I enjoy it every time I see it. It's just they got. If you watch it, you'll see they got flyovers of Jerusalem, which they wouldn't be able to get nowadays. It's just amazing.
I
Yeah,
saw the trailer, but I'll definitely watch the movie
yeah,
itself.
really recommend it. Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts, Dr. Magness, before we end the broadcast?
No, no, actually, I'm eager to watch what's left of the Super Bowl.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept you away from that, and
Yeah,
I want to thank you. I see how busy you are and how sought after you are. Agreeing to come on Insight for an interview is very humbling. I really appreciate you doing this, Dr.
thanks
Magness. Thank
for
you
having
very much for appearing. Bye bye.
Bye bye.